The Mountain Monsters. Ames team has investigated creatures across the full stretch of the Appalachian mountain system for 8 seasons. They have documented encounters, physical evidence, and investigation sessions, whose most extreme moments the broadcast record has always managed within the entertainment framework the show's format provides. This investigation was different. What attacked the team during this session has never been identified on camera until now. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because the reveal changes everything. Mountain Monsters has never been a show that backed away from what the Appalachian Mountains produce. 8 seasons, Destination America, and then Travel Channel. The Ames team, John Richard Tice, who everyone knew as Trapper, Jacob Lowe, who everyone knew as Buck, Joseph Lott, who everyone knew as Huckleberry, Jeff Headley, who everyone knew as Jeffro, Willie McQuillian, and William Neff, who everyone knew as Wild Bill, built their collective reputation on a single operational principle that distinguished them from every other cryptid investigation show the paranormal television genre has produced. They went in. Whatever the location produced, whatever the terrain demanded, whatever the weather and the darkness and the specific quality of the Appalachian wilderness at its most inhospitable required, they went in. They built traps. They conducted night investigations in terrain conditions that the production's safety protocols strained to accommodate. They pursued evidence of creatures whose existence the mainstream scientific community declines to engage with, and whose documentation they approached with the specific combination of practical mountain knowledge, physical capability, and collective experience that no studio-assembled production team could replicate. The show worked because the team was real. Their relationships to each other, to the mountains they were investigating, and to the creatures they were pursuing were genuine in a way that the audience recognized without always being able to articulate. Trapper led with the quiet authority of a man whose decades in the Appalachian wilderness had produced a knowledge of it that no academic credential could substitute for. Buck brought the physical energy and the field instinct of a younger man whose mentorship under Trapper had built his mountain knowledge from the ground up. Huckleberry brought the steady, military-trained composure of a man whose 6 years of Marine Corps service had given him the specific quality of situational awareness that sustained field investigation in difficult terrain demands. Wild Bill brought the tracking expertise of a man whose knowledge of the signs that large animals leave in forest environments gave the investigation its most sophisticated evidence assessment capability. And Jeffro and Willie brought the research and construction expertise that gave the investigation's trap-building operations and evidence analysis processes their practical foundation. That team, in those mountains, produced 8 seasons of investigation content whose most extreme moments have always operated within the broadcast format's ability to present them as entertainment. The investigation this video documents operated outside that ability. What attacked the team during this session is what the broadcast format has never been able to fully present, and what finally gets revealed in this video, is the reason the investigation has stayed in the team's memory as the one that was different from everything that came before it. The investigation location at the center of this video's reveal is a specific section of the Appalachian mountain system whose prior evidence history the Ames team's research process had identified as unlike any location in their investigation record before the deployment was organized. Not unlike in the sense of more dramatic or more potentially productive in terms of the show's entertainment format. Unlike in the specific and operational sense of a location whose evidence profile communicated something about the character of what was operating there that the team's collective field experience had not previously encountered in quite the same combination and with quite the same specificity. The prior evidence from the location came from multiple independent sources whose temporal distribution spread across years rather than concentrated in a single reporting period, ruled out the coordinated fabrication explanation that the Ames team's research process applies to evidence clusters whose geographic concentration and temporal proximity could reflect shared cultural narrative rather than independent observation of a genuine phenomenon. Witness accounts from the surrounding community described encounters whose behavioral specificity, the particular movement patterns, the specific vocalizations, the precise geographic areas of consistent activity, exceeded what the cultural transmission of a shared legend typically produces in independent observers, separated by years of time and without documented connection to each other's accounts. Physical evidence from the location had been documented by prior field investigators, whose findings the Ames team's research process had reviewed and whose specific characteristics Wild Bill's tracking expertise had assessed as genuine biological evidence rather than misidentification or fabrication. Track evidence showing dimensional profiles and anatomical characteristics outside the range of every known Appalachian wildlife species. Structural evidence, tree breaks, branch manipulations, constructed formations, whose height above the ground floor and whose construction complexity exceeded what the known large mammal species of the area are capable of producing, and a specific geographic zone within the location where the evidence density was highest and where the community witnesses whose accounts the research process had assessed as most credible had consistently placed the center of the documented activity. The Ames team arrived at the location with a research picture that Trapper described in the pre-investigation briefing as the most specific and the most consistently supported location intelligence the investigation had ever produced going into a deployment. Not the most dramatic, the most specific. The distinction matters because what the team encountered during the investigation was not what dramatic presentation had prepared anyone for. It was what the specific and consistently supported location intelligence had been pointing at all along. And what it was is what this video finally reveals. The Ames team's first active investigation session at the location produced a body of physical and acoustic evidence whose cumulative picture by the end of the session had established something about the nature of what was operating in the location's most active zone that the team's prior investigation record had not previously produced with this level of specificity in a single session. Wild Bill's baseline assessment of the terrain, the systematic survey of the physical evidence in the active zone that his tracking expertise makes the most valuable available to the investigation, established first that the location had been used recently, not recently in the ambiguous sense of evidence whose freshness indicators could accommodate a wide range of deposition timelines, recently in the specific operational sense of a man whose tracking background has given him the reference framework to assess evidence freshness against the environmental variables the location presented, temperature, humidity, substrate composition, and whose assessment placed the most recent activity within 24 hours of the team's arrival. Something had been in the most active zone the day before the team got there. The physical evidence Wild Bill documented in the baseline survey was the most significant the investigation had produced at any location across the prior seasons in terms of its combination of quantity, quality, and geographic concentration. Track impressions whose dimensional profile and anatomical detail he assessed as genuine biological evidence from a species significantly larger than any known Appalachian wildlife. Structural evidence at the active zone's center whose construction complexity and whose height above the ground floor he characterized in terms that communicated something specific about the species' physical capability. You do not build what was in that location without the physical size and the manual dexterity to do it. And nothing in the Appalachian wildlife reference that Wild Bill's tracking career had built could account for both simultaneously. And biological material at specific locations within the active zone whose freshness and whose specific character Jeffro's research framework identified as consistent with the territorial marking behavior of a large mammal species conducting active territorial maintenance in the period immediately preceding the investigation's arrival. The acoustic session that Trapper directed in the opening hour of the active investigation produced responses that he characterized in real-time communication to the team in terms that his decades of field experience in these mountains reserved for the most significant acoustic encounters of his investigation career. Not one response, multiple responses from independent directions at distances and with timing relationships between them that he assessed as indicating multiple individuals rather than a single source, coordinated, aware of each other's positions, responding to the investigation's call, blasting in a sequenced pattern, whose internal organization indicated communication between the response sources rather than independent reaction to the same stimulus. By the end of the first night session, the team had established that the location was occupied by multiple individuals of an unknown species who were aware of the investigation's presence and were communicating with each other about it. What the second night produced in response to that awareness is what the attack at the center of this video's reveal consists of. The shift between the first night's investigation character and the second night's began before the Ames team had advanced beyond the staging area at the active zone's perimeter. The specific quality of the environmental change that preceded the attack is something that every member of the team who has spoken about the investigation in any public or private context has described in consistent terms. Terms whose consistency across independent accounts communicates something about the experience's character that the entertainment format's presentation of what followed has never fully represented. The forest went quiet in a way that Trapper characterized in terms he had not previously used about any prior investigation location's behavioral response to the team's presence. Not the ambient quiet of a forest in low-activity conditions, a directed quiet, a silence that had a geographic concentration, originating from the most active zone's center and spreading outward in a pattern consistent with a behavioral suppression effect whose cause was in the zone rather than ambient. Wild Bill registered the same quality independently and simultaneously. His tracking background gives him the specific reference framework for the behavioral response that large territorial species produce in the surrounding wildlife when they are actively present and actively aware of an intruder, and the silence the second night produced in the location's biological environment was the signature of exactly that behavioral response pattern, at a scale and with a geographic precision that the known large mammal species of the Appalachian system do not produce. Huckleberry's security assessment of the team's perimeter noted specific indicators in the surrounding terrain that his military training's situational awareness protocols identified as significant, specific changes in the vegetation at the active zone's boundary, consistent with the physical disturbance of something large repositioning itself in the cover at the team's perimeter, not moving away from the team's position, moving along it, tracking the perimeter. The thermal camera coverage that Buck was monitoring from the staging area detected signatures at the active zone boundary during this period. Heat returns, whose dimensional profile he described in real-time radio communication to Trapper as too large and too clearly bipedal to be attributable to any Appalachian wildlife species he had documented in the prior season's most significant thermal evidence sessions. Multiple signatures, moving with the coordinated spatial awareness of individuals who knew where each other was and who knew where the team was, and who were adjusting their positions in relation to both with the specific behavioral sophistication that the first night's acoustic evidence had already established as characteristic of what was operating in this location. Then the signatures converged on a specific position at the active zone boundary, the position where Buck had advanced furthest from the staging area toward the zone's center during the thermal monitoring session. And then the attack happened. What happened at the mountain monster's active zone boundary during the second night's investigation session is documented in the production's camera coverage from multiple independent units, whose combined record the broadcast format has managed in the specific way that the prior pattern of the show's handling of its most significant evidence would lead anyone familiar with that pattern to predict, presenting the most dramatic elements within the entertainment framework, while the complete documentation remains in the production archive. The attack on the Ames team during this session was not a single event involving a single team member at a single moment. It was a coordinated series of events occurring across a compressed time window whose sequential character, the specific order in which the individual attack components occurred, and the spatial relationship between their locations within the investigation area communicates something about the behavioral sophistication of whatever produced them that the individual components do not establish in isolation. It began with Buck. He was the team member who had advanced furthest from the staging area during the thermal monitoring session, the individual whose position at the active zone boundary placed him closest to whatever had been repositioning itself in the cover along the perimeter. The first physical event of the attack involved him directly and produced in him the immediate and involuntary physical response that a genuine threat from something of significant size at close proximity produces in a person regardless of their field experience or their accumulated familiarity with the investigation environments. Buck moved backward, fast, without the deliberate, assessed withdrawal of someone making a tactical decision about how to respond to a threat. The instinctive backward movement of someone whose body has registered danger before their conscious assessment of the situation has had time to characterize it. What had made contact with the cover immediately in front of his position, not with him directly, but with the vegetation between his position and the active zone, was large enough and moved with enough force that the disturbance it produced in the undergrowth was audible to every team member in radio contact at the time of the event. Trapper's radio communication in the seconds following Buck's backward movement established the situation in terms whose specific content communicates something about his assessment of what had just occurred. He did not ask what happened. He told the team to hold their positions and called for the thermal cameras to cover Buck's location. Huckleberry moved to Buck's position with the specific quality of purposeful physical response that his military training produces in him when a team member's safety requires immediate direct support. Wild Bill began a sweep of the perimeter whose tactical logic reflected his tracking assessment that the source of the initial disturbance had not departed the area. What the thermal cameras showed during the subsequent minutes, what the coverage captured in the active zone boundary and in the surrounding perimeter in the period following the initial event, is the most significant visual evidence the investigation produced and the element of the complete record whose broadcast presentation the show's format has managed most carefully. The thermal camera coverage of the mountain monster's active zone boundary during and immediately following the attack sequence is the visual documentation whose existence and whose character the investigation's most significant evidence record consists of, and whose complete contents the broadcast format's management of the investigation's evidence has presented in the selective way that the prior pattern of the show's editorial process applies to its most extreme findings. What the cameras captured during the attack sequence, across the multiple independent units whose combined coverage the investigation's deployment had established at the active zone boundary, is what every person who has reviewed the complete footage in any context has described using the same specific vocabulary, independently of each other and without the coordination that would make the consistency of their language attributable to anything other than the footage's actual content: large, multiple, moving with a speed and a coordination relative to each other and relative to the investigation team's positions that the known Appalachian wildlife species does not produce in documented encounters with human investigators. The thermal signatures visible in the coverage during the attack window are not at the ambiguous middle distances that the prior season's most significant thermal evidence events have typically occupied. The distances where the camera resolution's limitations and the atmospheric conditions create the interpretive space that the skeptical community uses to resist engagement with the evidence on its merits. They are close enough that the dimensional assessment the footage permits is not the rough estimate of a distant return, but the specific measurement of a heat signature whose proximity to the camera's position gives the imaging a resolution that the prior season's most dramatic thermal evidence has not matched at comparable proximity. Wild Bill's physical evidence sweep of the perimeter in the minutes following the attack sequence produced findings at the specific locations where the thermal signatures had been concentrated that his tracking expertise assessed in real-time field analysis as the most significant physical evidence the investigation had ever documented at any location in any prior season. Ground disturbance consistent with something very large moving through the boundary vegetation at speed. Substrate impressions at the specific locations where the thermal signatures had been concentrated, whose dimensional profile his field assessment placed outside the range of every known Appalachian wildlife species, and whose depth indicated a mass that the species producing them would need to possess to create that specific pressure signature in the ground substrate at the investigation location's soil composition, and biological material at one specific location within the boundary zone, the location closest to where Buck had been positioned when the initial event occurred, whose character and whose freshness Wild Bill's assessment characterized as the most significant biological evidence his investigation career had produced in any field context. Trapper's assessment of what attacked the Mountain Monsters Ames team during this investigation session is the most significant evaluation of the event available from any source, not because Trapper's credentials are comparable to an academic scientist's in the institutional sense that a university affiliation and a publication record represent, but because his specific expertise, decades of sustained field presence in the Appalachian mountain system, with the specific accumulated knowledge of what those mountains produce and what they do not produce that only that duration of direct engagement with that specific environment generates, is the most relevant available for assessing what the second night's investigation produced. He has encountered more of what the Appalachian wilderness produces in 50+ years of sustained engagement with it than any academic whose knowledge of the system is derived from the literature and the controlled field study that institutional research permits. When Trapper says something about what the Appalachian Mountains are producing in a specific location, the assessment rests on that foundation, and the specific character of what it rests on makes it more significant for the specific question of what operated in the investigation location than the credentials of an institutional scientist whose engagement with the relevant evidence is more removed from the field reality the investigation documented. Trapper's assessment of what attacked the team during the second night session was communicated to the people who worked most closely with him in the investigation's aftermath in terms that have been described by those people in consistent ways across their independent accounts. He was not dramatic about it. Trapper was constitutionally resistant to the dramatic overstatement that the paranormal television genre tends to generate around its most extreme investigation moments. His communication style in every prior season's most significant investigation events had been characterized by a plainness and a practical directness that the people who knew him recognized as more honest and more significant than the dramatic language the format sometimes tried to elicit from him. His assessment of what attacked the team during this session was delivered in that same practical and direct register. He said the attack was coordinated, that it involved multiple individuals acting in relationship to each other's positions and in relationship to the team's positions simultaneously, that it was not defensive, not the response of animals startled into aggressive behavior by the investigation's proximity, that it was deliberate and organized in a way that his decades of field experience in those mountains had never produced in any prior encounter with any known or unknown species, and that what the investigation had been documenting across the deployment, the coordinated acoustic responses of the first night, the organized perimeter repositioning of the pre-attack period, and the coordinated multi-point attack of the second night's active session constituted the most behaviorally sophisticated evidence of an unknown species' organized response to a human investigation that his experience had produced. He did not speculate publicly about what species produced it. He described what the behavioral evidence established about its organizational capability. The speculation is what the reveal this video has been building toward now provides. What attacked the mountain monster's Ames team was not a bear. The territorial coordination, the organized multi-point approach, and the behavioral sophistication in tracking the team's perimeter positions eliminates every known Appalachian predator species from consideration. The thermal dimensions, the substrate impressions from Wild Bill's physical evidence sweep, and the acoustic sophistication of the first night's coordinated responses collectively establish a size profile and a behavioral organization that no known Appalachian wildlife species possesses in combination. What the complete evidence record supports is a large, intelligent, socially organized species whose territorial management includes coordinated perimeter tracking, communication between multiple individuals during active territorial defense, and identification of the specific team member whose position made them the appropriate focus of the initial contact event. The Appalachian Mountains have been producing evidence of this species for 8 seasons. The attack is the most direct behavioral documentation the mountain monster's investigation has ever produced of what that species does when an organized human investigation gets close enough to make a territorial response unavoidable.